Well, welcome back to this session. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening from or watching us from. My name's Owen Tudor. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, and I will be chairing this session on future prosperity and an inclusive labour market. Now, we've got a great panel of speakers lined up for you, but we do also obviously want to hear from you towards the end of the session. The theme of the G7 is, of course, being Build Back Better this year. So we're going to be looking at some of the current schemes, some of the new ideas and future plans that are needed to realise that ambition, or what the International Trade Union Confederation calls recovery and resilience. We'll also look at what we're aiming to build back better from, assessing some of the most urgent threats to our shared prosperity and proposing solutions to overcome them. I'm not going to introduce our speakers all in one go. I'll do it bit by bit as we go through this process, but I'll be looking in particular for whatever they can tell us about the new social contract that the International Trade Union Confederation wants to see established as part of the future. Our first speaker then today is Stefano Scapetta. Stefano has been the director of the Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Directorate of the OECD since 2013. He leads the work of the organisation in a number of broad areas, including employment, labour, migration, health, skills, gender, and tackling inequalities. And he contributes to the implementation of the Secretary-General's strategic orientations in these areas. Stefano represents the OECD in the G20, as well as the G7 and many other high-level international fora on his lead areas. So, Stefano, over to you.
Thank you very much, Owen. It is really a great pleasure for me to be today with you at this L7 summit, and in particular to participate in this panel on prosperity and an inclusive labour market. Let me start by say a few words about the context. I'm pretty sure that throughout the summit you have been discussing some of the statistics, some of the facts that characterize our labour markets in the G7 economies and beyond. It goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic already had vast social and economic disruption in the G7 countries. That is the focus of our discussion today, but actually globally, most of the OECD countries. As you said, Owen, we have been supporting the G7 and the G20, documenting the unfolding impact of this crisis on the labour market, the social impact, but with a particular focus on those groups that are emerging very clearly as those being most affected by this crisis. Some of the statistics are well known. In only 2 months, the month of May, March and April of 2020, we have seen the unemployment rate in the G7 countries doubling from 4.6% to 9.2%. In particular, because some countries like Canada and the US saw a skyrocketing unemployment because many workers were laid off, if and only temporary. Since then, with the partial reopening over the summer of the past few months, we have seen the unemployment rate decline to 5.8% in February of this year, still significantly above the level it had before the onset of the pandemic. But I think more than ever, the unemployment rate doesn't really capture the extent of the impact of this pandemic crisis onto the labour market. As we know, in many of the G7 countries and beyond, many workers have seen significant reduction in working time. Just at the peak in April of 2020, across the OECD, total working hours declined by more than 12%, so 10 times more than what happened after the global financial crisis. Many individuals, many workers were in job retention schemes.
I was on mute.
Just to give you an idea, again, there were 60 million workers in the OECD in job retention schemes. Again, 10 times more than what we have seen after the global financial crisis. And perhaps what is more worrisome from my point of view is that actually the unemployment rate does not capture the extent, also because a number of workers at the time in which lockdown or severe containment measures stopped basically company from hiring, they were not even looking for work. So we have seen an unprecedented increase in non-participation of people actually leaving the labor market, even only temporarily. These are the aggregate effect, but also, as we know, some groups have been particularly affected. First and foremost, I would say young people. This is not surprising. In any crisis, young people suffer more. We have seen the unemployment rate for young people increasing much more than for adults. We have seen hours drop for young people 10 percentage point higher than for adults. And of course, also hiring is extremely low in many countries. Workers in low occupation, they were on the front line actually to provide essential service on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fewer of them were able to work from home because of the nature of their job or because of the lack of even basic equipment. Some groups like non-white and indigenous population, Canada and the United States, have seen the employment rate fall much more than for the other groups. So again, significant impact on groups. Of course, women were also in the front line. We have seen a much larger decline in employment in the first wave of the pandemic, although actually there's been some recovery, and basically the impact on men and women on employment has been more balanced. But of course, many women have lost also in terms of working hours and had to provide also services at home. So what can the G7 countries do? We at the OECD have been proposing to the G7, also to the Task Force on Employment, a three-pronged approach. Promoting a job-rich recovery. Thanks also to the vaccination campaign, the economy is reopening, and I think it is essential to really boost a job-rich recovery. Preventing labor market exclusion for those groups most affected, and preparing for future risk, but also for the many opportunities that the recovery, also the massive recovery plans will certainly promote. So let me start with promote a job-rich recovery. Here I think there is a need to support job creation and reallocation. And this includes supporting those who continue to be severely impacted by the health crisis, with lockdown enduring in a number of countries. This also means supporting business creation, while actually avoiding the bankruptcies of high-performing but overly in-debt companies, and certainly facilitating the hiring and support for job seekers with employers. In particular, we are saying that specific support for the hiring of young people, in my view, is essential. The second priority must be to prevent the exclusion and to protect the workers, including by reaching out quickly to those who have left, even only temporarily, the labor market, or those who are at risk of exclusion from the employment measures. And these include a number of young people, a number of women, a number of those with low skills that have seen the job vanishing, and for whom in this very uncertain time might be difficult to think about new jobs. The third priority, in my view, should be focusing on preparing for future opportunities and risk, and therefore strengthening the resilience of the labor market. It goes without saying, I'm sure you have discussed that extensively, that this crisis once again has shown that even in the G7 economies, there were significant gaps both on the employment and the social protection. Gaps that basically did not provide the same level of support to some of the workers in what we can call non-standard form of employment. Also because of the massive recovery plans that all the G7 countries are about to launch, I think it's absolutely time to close these gaps and to make sure we can provide minimum, at least, support, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of social protection to all workers, almost regardless of the type of contract they have. Let me say that in this context, and not just because I'm addressing an L7 summit, the social partners have played a major role in helping government basically respond to this emergency crisis, but I think also can and should play an essential role in designing, and perhaps even more importantly, in implementing the recovery plans. This is one opportunity in a lifetime, actually several lifetimes, in actually using these massive resources in a way that can strengthen the recovery, make this recovery more inclusive, but actually address climate change and build resilience in our labor market, in our society. So closing the gaps in employment policies, in social protection, in my view, is essential. And I think here your role is indeed very important. Indeed, our contribution to the G7 task force has been to highlight the groups most in need of support, being as specific as possible as we can be in identifying good practices. There are many across the G7 countries, and focus as much as possible about implementation of measure, not only statement of intention. I think this will possibly contribute to build very strong language that the task force on employment will deliver to the G7 summit. And again, under the assumption that indeed the question about labor market, social issue will play a central role in the deliberation of the leaders of the G7. So these are some of the observations I would like to share with you, but I very much look forward to our discussion with the other colleague panelists, but also with all of those listening to us. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Stefano. I particularly liked your reference to closing the gaps on social protection, not just inside the G7 for non-standard employees, but also in less developed countries. And as people may know, the ITC is promoting a global fund for social protection to help ensure that happens. You'll notice alongside me, we've been joined by a visual scribe who will be putting together an interpretation of the meeting that we're having today, and that work will be distributed to everybody at the end of, or after the end of the session. We now move on to my old friend and colleague, Pierre Habbard, General Secretary now to the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Quite the longest job title I think anybody in the movement has got. He focuses on TUAC's three core issues of tax avoidance, corporate social responsibility and digitalisation. He's former senior policy advisor at the Trade Union Advisory Committee, which is where I first knew him, covering responsible investment, tax, finance, pensions, corporate governance, finance regulation and public governance. I'm glad to see that his job responsibilities have shrunk as he's moved up to the position of General Secretary, although I suspect he's even busier now. He served on the board of directors of Oxfam France and on the Stakeholder Council of the Global Reporting Initiative. So, Pierre.
Merci. Thank you, Owen, and thanks also to Stefano for joining us for this L7 summit, as well as to our colleagues for the Y7WC7. There are two questions actually for that session: future prosperity and inclusive labor market. Of course, from a trading point of view, we want to say that the answer to future prosperity is to inclusive labor market with substance, but we have to agree that for some government, that's not necessarily, that link is not naturally natural. Our economies are still in intensive care unit. The exceptional crisis measures, so the short-term work schemes, job retention schemes, have been prolonged under a good dose of uncertainty. They need to be prolonged, they need to be extended. We need that because, in a sense, Stefano perhaps alluded to that, is that we still sadly not have to to perceive the full impact of the crisis. Once we're out of this intensive care unit, there's an obvious risk that we will go through a long and painful moment on labor markets unless we have it right. If the job retention schemes are retrieved too quickly, or in an uncoordinated manner, or not in targeted manner, the scares of the crisis will obviously be apparent, and not only that, they could be bloody. We know that. We know that the return to workplace and the reopening of all sectors will be crucial on how hard the crisis will hit us and who it will hit. So this is where the L7 has a clear message, as you know, to the G7 leaders when it comes to exiting this pandemic: coordinated vaccination efforts, availability, affordability of testing, workplace safety protocols, and resilient supply chain. We've been discussing this in the early session among others. But beyond this situation where we are, which is about managing a crisis emergency measures by government, we would look for the G20 to offer some collective perspective to precisely show that there is an end to this tunnel, that we can actually have some perspective for recovery. There's a role for the G7 to maintain a positive dynamic around coordinated stimulus recovery plan. That's why we have those G forums for the G7, the G20, for government to agree to support the economy in times of crisis and to spread the word, including in forums like the IMF and the OECD. To give a concrete example, just a couple of months ago, the OECD revised its growth projections almost at the last minute following the announcement by the Biden administration of its two-step stimulus plan. One right now to help American working families and one for the long term. So from there, let me perhaps from a training perspective share two questions that we all have in mind: how to spend it, how to spend the money to support our economy, and how to fund it. How to spend it, it should be clear that there should be strings attached to business support, attached to government conditions that we impose for government support to business. We have to realize that there are out there massive tax and debt deferrals. There's massive state loan guarantees out there. It is the fact that our economy is an intensive care unit is a reality. And there is increasingly equity support for business, support to private business. So far, so good, but we must be firm on the conditions we want for that. If business supports gets public money, there should be some commitments, some mechanism to protect jobs, fair wages, worksite representations, framed by collective agreement. There should be, and we had Sharon and the colleagues before discussing this, a recovery, government support that works for sustainable engines of growth toward low carbon and green investment. And indeed, a topic that is personally close to my heart, which is to have very strict corporate governance and tax standards. If public money goes into private business, that money should not feed in tax havens. It should not feed in short-term dividends payments. And last but not least, it should be framed by responsible business conduct. The second question is how to fund it. It is essential that we engage a discussion on recovery that is linked to tax reform. Of course, there is a broader discussion on rising sovereign debt, whether debt is sustainable, whether there should be debt cancellations. For sure, there should be for some countries, the low-income countries and the emerging countries. For the OECD countries, it is a discussion that is on. But let me tell you that there's one part of the answer, and that is with tax reforms for sure. Tax reforms matters as for social justice. It matters in the context of exploding, uncontrolled rise in income inequality. It also matters for the sustainability of our recovery strategy. Currently, all eyes on the expected agreements that we should have in July under the auspice of the G20, agreement on a minimum tax floor. As you know, negotiations being held are administratively organized, hosted by the OECD. This would be a major step forward to help reduce mutually destructive the tax rates to the bottom. But this is just the beginning of the discussion on tax reform. There are, as we know, many regulatory loopholes when it comes to the digital business. Beyond that, we need progressive tax reform to ensure far better redistribution of wealth. Let me point out to one aspect to a move toward more progressive tax reform, and that's the essential need to reverse downward trend towards corporate income tax. There, on that topic, the OECD is a bit silent. It's very welcome that the Biden administration is now raising its own corporate income tax. This should be a point we should raise with the G7. But let me obviously move towards the second part of the discussion, which is where does labor market reform stand, and how can we ensure some mutually supportive dynamic between labor markets on the one hand and fiscal and monetary policy on the other. We are entering into the COVID-19 crisis with a global economy that is very fragile, that never really recovered from the 2008 crisis, and that frankly, since the past 10 years, has been running on a single engine, monetary policy, central banks pumping money into the economy. The situation where we are is excessive corporate and household debt levels, low productivity, and last but not least, stagnating wages. So if any, the COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of our labor market systems. It's very obvious with what we call the essential workers, They are being praised for supporting our economy. Essential workers in the public services, essential workers in the platform economy. But when you look at their pay grade, when you look at their employment protection, at their pension, at their health entitlement, well, they are sadly enough not very essential to our economy. So a key point that we have to bring to the G7 and to international organizations, including to start with the OECD, is that compared to the 2008 crisis, our labor market institutions are much more fragile. We have less coverage of collective agreements, of collective bargaining agreements, and these agreements are less protective. The recovery that we're living through officially over the last 10 years has been happening on the back of the erosion of our protection, of collective and individual protection. And things were not all equal. It happened on the back of accelerated digitalization, which, as we has been feeding more standard forms, a rise in non-standard forms of work. So if indeed G7 countries are like-minded countries, and if indeed the OECD are like-minded countries, they should be much more vocal when it comes to reversing the trend towards the erosion of our institutions. That is perhaps where there is room for improvement. For the time being, most governments are pushing for indeed what could be called a new labor market of opportunities. We agree with that. Greater mobility, greater access to skills, more investment into active labor markets, and indeed with more minimum floors. Indeed, some welcome attention to global safety nets. But we agree. But when we talk about building back better, it should also be about building labor market institutions back better. We cannot build back better if we continue towards this continuing degrading, the erosion in our labor market institutions. This is needed again for social justice, but also for growth. Just a couple of weeks before the beginning of the pandemic, the OECD a year ago provided a very grim picture of economic growth, exposing stagnating growth because of stagnating wages, stagnating income of working people, despite the fairly low unemployment levels across our economy. So we need to build back our institution better, and for that we need to have a bit more perspective. When were our societies more equal? When did people still have a chance to attain the middle class? And when did we have a middle class that actually matters for growth, that was itself an engine for sustainable growth? Part of the answer is in labor market institutions. So that's, again, you know it. It's a clear message that we want to bring to the G7. We agree each labor market systems are different. There are differences between the United States system and France, Germany, but there are common principles and there's a common direction. And there again, let's say it can happen if there is political will. We will agree that the PRO-Act proposal in the United States shows the way forward. There is political will to bring back some collective forms of protection. So this is a key message: fair labor market outcomes before redistribution kicks in. This is what the G7 should commit to. In general, for our entire working population, but also bringing on board the key vulnerabilities that have been addressed yesterday and today, gender inequalities, including pay and pension gaps that are affecting women, support the youth, which has been hit front on by the crisis, through by better transition from education to labor market, among others, tackle racial justice, and among others, address again and again the regulatory gaps that we face with the acceleration of digitalization. So these are among the key issues, the key demands that we have, and I naturally look forward to the conversation. Over to you, Owen.
Thanks very much indeed, Pierre. Obviously, an enormous agenda there. I was particularly struck by your references to sustainable growth and the need for responsible business, and in particular, also, I think, for the higher wages, especially for the frontline workers that you mentioned. Right. We're now going to introduce some guests from the Y7, the Youth 7. We have Dominic Jones and Casey Wang. Dominic is from Barnsley in Yorkshire. He's a student of politics at the University of Liverpool, which means I think he's defected from one side of the Pennines to the other. He's got significant experience in advocating on behalf of young people through his roles in from the local youth council all the way up to the UK Youth Parliament and National Youth Select Committee. And his interests lie especially in skills and development. He wants to ensure that young people have access to the best opportunities, regardless of their location or background. Casey Wang, from the other side of the Atlantic, which I think is a slightly smaller gap than crossing the Pennines from Barnsley to Liverpool, is the US youth delegate for global economy to the G7 summit. She's a Yenching Scholar at Peking University, a Master's in Economics and Business Management, and a co-chair of the Yenching Global Symposium. She's worked for the US Department of Commerce, the US Consulate in Shanghai, and the Georgia Department of Economic Development. She graduated from Georgetown University in 2020 with a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and was accepted early to Harvard Law School, where I think, Casey, your job is to become the editor of the review on your way to the presidency. So Dominic first and then Casey, and I'll leave you in their hands. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much, Owen. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Casey. My colleague Dominic and I are representing Y7, as you just mentioned. So we want to highlight two of our labor priorities today, and I will outline the first, and Dominic will outline the second. So first, our vision of the world is one in which good job opportunities, especially in the green and digital sectors, are widely available, and young people are supported into these jobs through accessible and quality training programs. Very much aligns with one of L7's key priorities in promoting our future prosperity. So to achieve this vision, we want G7 leaders to support young people into work through green and digital job creation. In other words, investing in infrastructure that not only creates jobs, but is forward-looking and sustainable. Further, when we look towards building back better through President Biden's infrastructure plan, for example, we want leaders to ask, how can we create jobs for young people when we are expanding digital infrastructure or building green infrastructure such as public transit, for instance. We also want G7 leaders to keep incentivizing the hiring of young people. This is, as Stefano said earlier, very important. Current initiatives include France's One Young, One Solution program, the UK's Kickstart program, and Germany's secure apprenticeship programs for small and medium-sized enterprises. We call on leaders to strengthen vocational training programs. So many public apprenticeship programs are available, but how can they be expanded across industries, and how can we make them more accessible to young people who are the most disproportionately affected by the pandemic? The German apprenticeship model is known to be highly successful, and even if it isn't completely replicable, and as Pierre said, labor markets are different, but we are working towards a common direction, and G7 leaders should still engage in exchanging best practices and optimizing existing programs amidst economic recovery and planning for the future of work. And lastly, we want G7 leaders to collaborate on G7 NEET reduction. So according to the OECD, the average youth unemployment in G7 countries for ages 15 to 24 is at 11.5% as of February, which is more than double the unemployment rate of the general working age population. So this is higher in some countries than others, and we believe there's a lot of room for collaboration among G7 countries to reduce that. So over to Dominic.
Very much, and it's a privilege to be here. One of the areas that we've been focusing on as a Y7 is ensuring that workplace policies allow workers, and in particular young workers, to contribute to healthy and fulfilling lives. So it's about ensuring dignity in the workplace, so improving conditions, of course, improving pay, in particular young people doing the same job, but also the gender inequalities with pay. We've seen the work that the gender pay gap has allowed to continue in the UK, but unfortunately there's still work to do. So the G7 gender pay gap in 2019 was 15.4%. So there's also conditions. We need to tackle discrimination and racism in the workplace, as well as valuing young people as well. Also, we need to look at labour issues as an ongoing thing. So therefore, we support the continuation of the G7 Employment Task Force for future G7s. And we've really found this a useful and important tool to not only engage on young people's issues, but also labour issues as well. And then also health as well. So mental health is the next pandemic facing the world. It's going to be the next crisis, in particular for young people. So part of that, we need to look at how managers can be trained, how mental health can become less of a stigma in workplaces. And also workplace safety is a very important aspect of ensuring that young workers in particular enjoy the work. So it's about ensuring that the authorities, the health and safety executive, for example, in the UK, and the unions are empowered to ensure that health and safety is a key priority within the workplace. I'd just like to echo some of the points that are raised about youth unemployment, in particular what Stefano said. Maybe the picture is looking okay and recovering, but it's very concerning. In our UK survey alone, 43% of young people want more and better jobs, and that should be the focus of our recovery and the future market. It's not just about kind of more jobs. It should be about good quality. It should be about meaningful. And at the end of the day, we want to help young people and create a better labour market. So I'd just like to echo what's been said before, in particular pay as well. So it's about ensuring that pay can actually allow workers to develop. And just like to thank everybody for the opportunity to represent young people on this topic. And we look forward to any further questions or engagement you have. So back over to you, Owen.
Thanks indeed, Dominic and Casey, and apologies for some of the sound quality on Dominic's excellent intervention. I noticed quality jobs, decent work, apprenticeship, mental health, and also workplace safety. And it's worth remembering, of course, that tomorrow, the 28th of April, is International Workers' Memorial Day, when we're campaigning for health and safety to become a fundamental right at work. If I can remind people, we have a Q&A function, which we'll get to after our speakers, so do put your questions into that section. It now gives me enormous pleasure to introduce my old employer, we don't call it boss in the trade union movement.
Hi.
Francis became the General Secretary.
Francis O'Grady, and I just want to start by remembering some words from President Higgins, the President of Ireland, where he talked about the danger of feigned amnesia. He was talking about colonialism and empire, but I think there is an equal risk of feigned amnesia when it comes to the pandemic and how we ended up where we are. Owen asked that question in his introduction, build back better from what? And the truth is, of course, that the pandemic exposed very deep inequalities of wealth and power, but also on the basis of class, race, gender. Because of the bankers' crash a decade ago, some governments had introduced austerity programs that ended up ensuring that working people paid the price for something that was not of their making. But it also had a real and material impact on our public services and our preparedness to meet a pandemic that clearly has had a devastating impact on many families, but also on our economies too. And yet somehow, having been through that pandemic, we're not through it, but having kind of begun to get on top of it in the UK through the rollout of the vaccine, we have still ended up with our healthcare workers being offered a 1% cap on their pay and public sector workers getting 0, and huge numbers of key workers, not least social care workers, still dependent on the national minimum wage, the majority of them earning well under £10 an hour, and very often on 0 hours and agency contracts, so not knowing when their next pay check will come through or how much will be in it. So it seems that we need some honesty and some acknowledgement of the inequality that we've started from, and the fact that through this pandemic, currently there isn't a significant sign of change in some members of the G7, and certainly not at a sufficient level collectively to meet the challenges that we face. For the TUC's part, we've got some very simple priorities around jobs, around safety, around equality. And we also recognise that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that calls for a new internationalism, not just in respect of vaccines and ventilators, although for sure the India are a reminder of why it's so important that we take a global approach, but also in terms of our understanding and commitment to public goods and services, like from water to health services, the importance of a welfare safety net. In the UK, for example, we still have pitiful levels of sick pay, and millions of workers are excluded even from that, meaning they're faced with the Hobson's choice of doing the right thing by public health in taking time off work to self-isolate, or being able to put food on the table for their families. And also, we think it's important that we recognise we need every worker to have basic rights. We won a famous victory in the highest court in the UK against Uber, so that drivers there are entitled to at least the national minimum wage, holiday pay, and that critical right to be accompanied by a trade union. But that has to signal a change for the whole gig economy and a business model that has been built on ripping off the taxpayer in terms of how much they pay to the exchequer, but also ripping off their workers. We know we've got big challenges ahead. We're not out of the woods with this pandemic yet. We know that, certainly with the risk of new variants. We've got big challenges that we've been talking about in terms of climate change and how we achieve a just transition, but also in the rise of the tech titans and the importance of AI and automation. We know from the work that the TUC and others have done that AI alone will generate multi-billion-dollar gains in productivity, and it seems that there should now be an urgent, wider debate in the G7 about how we ensure that working people and all people in our countries get a fair share of that dividend, so that we can improve working lives and put some meaning into that phrase of levelling up. And just finally, I would agree with everybody else that this isn't just about wealth and income, it is also about power. Trade unions, as the only democratic independent institutions of working people, have found themselves under attack for 40 years, whether that's through curtailment of our freedoms through the law, whether it's companies in some countries seeking to union bust, or whether it's those huge changes in the labour market where we've seen that mushrooming of insecure work that is notoriously hard to organise. Doesn't let us off the hook, we've got to do it, but we know those structural changes have also diminished trade unions' membership strength and organisation. That has to change. We've seen too much, particularly perhaps in the UK and the US in recent times, of political capture by big corporations, which hasn't served the interests of ordinary people. So one way to get the fairer economy and the stronger society that we all want to see, a critical way to build back better, is to see unions grow again. Thank you.
Thanks indeed to Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC in Great Britain, and therefore host of the L7 this year, putting starkly the choice between putting food on the table or doing the right thing in terms of the pandemic, even in a rich country like the UK. So last but not least, in terms of our speakers, the G20 is Italian this year, so we turn for our last speech to Gianna Fracassi, who since January 2019 has been the Deputy Secretary General of CGIL in Italy, with various functions based in Rome, dealing with issues like green transformation, economic policies, the next generation EU, policies of complex and non-complex crisis areas, and so on. There are indeed too many things on Gianna's agenda for me to summarize, so I will simply pass over to Gianna for our concluding speech before we get to the Q&As. Do remember to put your questions in there. Gianna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Owen. But build back better. I think it's a big issue for the government and the union as well, after an unprecedented economic and social crisis left by the pandemic. We think that courageous policies are needed to face and counter this extraordinary phase. In fact, the crisis imposes sort of revolution of priorities, I would say, a collective change that places the person and the primary needs, starting with health, at the center of the policies. The first point is for us jobs, its quality and its creation. In Italy, we lost 1 million jobs in the year of pandemic. We think that we need new responses in order to leave anyone behind, to fight against impoverishment and underemployment, and build a sort of framework of protection and universal right, and an individual right to lifelong learning as well, to achieve the skills for digital and green economy. Inclusion labor market means job must be qualified, precariousness must be reduced and eliminated, new rules must be defined to wage dumping and to protect workers. It is very important, and of course it is necessary to make protection of health and safety in the workplace. Job creation, I said, job creation especially in the public sector, and creating job with a sort of public program. We ask for this in our country. This is quite simply, I think, the overall message and the responsibility that we as trade unionists need to convey in the G7 and in the G20. To do this, we need an alliance against those who want to use the pandemic to go back the way it was before, who do not understand that the real lessons that the pandemic is to address social inequalities, and economic choices will be fundamental. It is necessary to choose an high road to development. This is a phase of extraordinary transformation of productive assets, of work, as well as people's lives. Qualifying the choices made now will be useful for the future. The centrality of fundamental needs of individual welfare states, territory, the value of work and knowledge, and global challenges, ecological and environmental as well. To do that, we need public investment. Next generation, the European program, is very important, but it's not enough. We need at least until 2030 to have an investment of this size and perhaps more to recover and to meet ambitious targets of emission reduction and decarbonization. So we need a massive public investment program, and an effort must be necessarily collective and global. In fact, is precisely the health emergency, the ecological and digital transition that concretely pose the need to overcome the current model of development. This means planning and fighting for quality of production, revaluation of common and public goods, saving of energy, raw materials, the protection of environment, and the fight against inequalities and territorial disparities. A development model based on essential pillars such value of work, health, welfare, education and training, environment. In order to do this, we need a new leading role for the state, which not only in this extraordinary phase cannot simply play the role of regulator of traffic. The renewed public role must involve not only national policies, but also European and global policies. We do not make the mistake of the crisis 2008 that in our country has a big cost. This means, in a global perspective, to address for issue of inequalities that affect especially poorest countries. This inequality can be overcome if there is a strong public role, starting with guarantee of fundamental rights, health, education. It is necessary to face with extreme strength and rapidities homogeneous rules on fiscal side in order to contrast the phenomenon of dumping. G7 and G20 should give some answer. A global alliance for fiscal justice, it is necessary. And we need, I think, is unacceptable in the pandemic that the wealth of richest has increased. Unacceptable, the polarization that leaves behind the most. And we need to tax in the richest. This is the right to guarantee resources to straighten public system. In an ordinary phase, extraordinary instrument must be introduced in the name of solidarity and cohesion. At the end, I would say that it is very important investment in education. Education determines the caesura between those who will be able to face the great digital and green transformation and those who will be not. It is the greatest in education where the greatest inequality is. So I think it's the hour of responsibility and the cohesion of collective work and answer to people's needs. We cannot miss the opportunity to save ourselves together. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much to Gianna for that. We've got a series of questions and we've only got 12 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the questions that people have been putting in the Q&A from the floor. Apologies for not giving you the floor. And I'll then ask all of us, because if they want to intervene, you don't have to answer all the questions that I'm going to read out, because we probably won't have time. But the first question comes from an old friend, Stephen Spence, from the UK trade union movement. He in particular directs this at Stefano. The UK pre-pandemic had creative industries worth 112 billion in the UK alone, and the virus has had an enormous impact on those. What do the OECD think governments need to do as we come out of the crisis about things like the cultural as well as other industries? Now, other questions that people have raised, while Stefano thinks about the answer to that one, Janet Yellen's recent comments in the US have raised the prospect of real change over the issue of a minimum tax on businesses. What role can that play, and how likely is it now that the US seems to be on board? A third question about inclusive labour markets. What can the care economy deliver? What do we need to do about investing in the care economy? And in view of the recent resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, not that it's a new issue, what can we do to tackle racism in the global economy? And if anybody's got time at the end of that, and I might start off with Dominic and Casey, what are the most effective ways to tackle youth unemployment that we've seen around the G7? Casey mentioned the German apprenticeship system, and what can we do about that? So Dominic, Casey, would one of you like to go first?
If it's okay, I'll go first and just kind of put a few ideas out there, because it's a very complicated picture, and we as a Y7 find it quite hard to kind of advocate for one position. We're still negotiating. There's so many things that can be done, but you've got to essentially start at the root of the issue, and that's essentially, are young people ready for work, and are the jobs that are ready for that? So things like Kickstart, things like the apprenticeship scheme in Germany are really good, but at the other end, you've got to get them into work. So things that are happening in France, such as youth subsidies and measures like that, to ensure that young people are a heart of the workforce kind of going forward, because we know that the impact on future earnings, if you're not in work as a young person and not getting into the labour market, it is significant. So things like youth subsidies, things like quotas on getting young people into the workforce are really important. But alongside that, you must also have skills and development, and things like Kickstart and things that kind of tackle pre-existing issues of NEET issues are really important. And that's why we're calling for things like a NEET task force. We're calling for continuation of job quality assessment and provision. So if Casey has anything to add, I'll go over to that. But that's from a Y7 point of view. We're just currently exploring those options.
Casey?
Yeah, totally agree with Dominic. I think just two really quick points. On the apprenticeship program, for example, when we look at Biden's American Jobs Plan, he's looking at how we can improve the American apprenticeship program and how we can expand that beyond just skilled trades. And I think that's really important for G7 leaders to exchange best practices in that area, because Germany and the UK have been doing that for a long time. So that's one area. Second area is like incentivizing the hiring of young people. So the different G7 countries have done it differently, and there have been different rates of effectiveness. You have wage subsidies in some European countries. In some US states, we have tax incentives for job creation. So I think how we can exchange, how those tools can be measured, and how much jobs they actually create, and how long those jobs actually last. I think those are really important, and there should be more exchange on those kinds of policy tools.
Okay, Stefano, I wonder if you've had time to think about the answer to Stephen's question, and perhaps you might reflect on Janet Yellen's recent intervention and the question of corporate tax rates.
No, thank you very much, Owen, and thanks to Steve for the question. I think the creative industry, together with travel, tourism, hotel and restaurant, have been some of the industry most affected during this more than a year-long pandemic. So I think our policy, and actually what many countries have been doing, to provide the support to these essential industries. They play an important role. I think, as you said in the question, they represent an important part of the economy. I think the big challenge that the UK and all countries are facing is moving from across-the-board support, when basically the country was in a lockdown, to target support to those sectors that are still deeply affected by the remaining confinement measures. So the creative industry is one of those. So moving from across the board to targeted support, and avoid that many companies who actually are viable actually go bust simply because the support has been withdrawn too soon. Actually, one of the main policies and one of the main preoccupation we have at OECD is that there is, and this is good, a lot of focus on the recovery plan, but we should not forget that many companies, many jobs, many workers need support now. So we produce a report called The Bridge to the Recovery. And I think there is a potential tendency for some countries to think about the recovery and forget about the fact that some emergency measures are still vital for many companies and actually for the jobs within these companies. The second point about the minimum tax, what Janet Yellen said, that actually the new administration is a game changer. I mean, we have been discussing the G20 and beyond, BEPS, base erosion, profit shifting, which is an international agreement to make sure that each company pay a fair share of taxes, regardless of where they are located and regardless of where their profit shows up. Now, with the statement by the President of the United States and by Janet Yellen point about minimum taxes, this discussion is reopened. Now there is hope that indeed the G20 will be able to agree on the BEPS, again, on the base erosion, profit shifting. We have been working on that for a long time. Very quickly, telegraphically, there was a question about care workers. We have discovered yet again how essential they are. We actually published a report just in the fall of 2020, highlighting the fact that we all know that there is a huge growing demand for care workers, yet pay, working condition, career progress are very weak across the board, across all of the OECD and G20 countries. So we need to make progress in working condition in the care sector in order to attract workers, but also to give them sort of reasonable working condition and some career progress. And then the last point, and I conclude with that, the Black Lives Matter has revealed once again the huge problem we have with ethnic minorities. I hope, building on the extensive work we have done at OECD on promoting diversity in our economies and society, that the OECD will also be able to focus also on specific policies to tackle ethno-racial discrimination, which unfortunately is still very present in many of the OECD countries. We need data, we need evidence, we need actually to highlight what are the good practices in tackling ethno-racial discrimination. I hope that we can actually launch this project that builds on the work we have done on gender equality, on LGBTI, and also on the integration of migrants into our economies and society.
Thanks very much indeed, Stefano. Now, Francis has had to leave us to go and prepare for chairing the next session. So the last word really comes to Pierre to answer any of the questions that haven't been, that he doesn't feel have been tackled fully. And you've got 2 or 3 minutes, Pierre. So, so over to you.
On the tax, the agreements that we should expect in July would be obviously a major step forward. It would stop what is called the race to the bottom, but will it offer a comprehensive answer to what we call for? Obviously, no. It will put an end to this mutually destructive tax race. It will reduce incentives for companies to artificially relocate in official or less official tax havens, but it will still be. It will not answer to the question related to the under-taxation of certain business models, such as the digital economy, and to the reallocation of taxing rights between countries within the OECD, but also with developing economies. There's much work to be done yet. And it is a challenge. For example, today it's fairly difficult to measure intangibles, new forms of intangibles, the value created by data, the value created by brand. If you don't know how to measure things, it makes obviously life a bit more complicated if you want to tax it. And I note, as we have the G20 colleagues, I mean the CGIL of the G20 here, the G20 is actually doing some work on how to better measure intangibles. Regarding youth, I mean, clearly this is an area we know more or less the recipe. We know where to move ahead, support jobs for youths, better transition between education and schools, apprenticeship, of course. These are among the toolbox. The question is more the package and the political will. And last, but on the care economy, I think as Stefano, the care economy is a good example of all the things that may go wrong at the same time. It's a sector that have heavy public service duties. It's a sector where you have loads of, where if any, there's been a massive erosion of labor rights, of collective agreements. And it is a sector where the business model itself, how it is funded, is completely wrong. So it's not the only sector, but it is one area where we should move fast because it is really, so to speak, a sad example of all the things around regulation and collective protection, how things have gone wrong. Last, but I hear indeed what Stefano says. I mean, one of the achievements of the G7 would be to bring light and for a cause on the racial injustice, on diversity. And it would be much welcome indeed if the OECD could join the bandwagon, I don't know if that's the expression, and with a mandate of the G7, among others, to push for a new agenda on that front. Thanks to you. Over to you, Owen.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Pierre, as a closing remark, and hopefully that will be taken up. Can I close this session by thanking our interpreters, thanking all of our speakers, thanking the backroom staff who made sure that this event happened, and also, of course, thank you in the audience. It's been a packed 2 days. We're not quite finished yet, but we're almost at an end of this L7. So I'm going to close this session now and get ready for the next session. Please move there now. Thanks also to our scribe. Bye-bye.